Sarah Martinez had always believed in serving her country with honor. At 28, she wore her Air Force uniform with pride, her polished boots clicking against the concrete floors of Whitmore Air Base every morning at precisely 0600 hours. The base sat in the middle of Nevada's desert, surrounded by miles of sand and secrecy. Most personnel called it home, but Sarah had begun to sense something wasn't quite right about the place she'd served for 3 years. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning in October. Sarah worked in the communications division, monitoring radio transmissions and maintaining secure networks between Whitmore and other military installations. Her clearance level allowed her access to most areas of the base, though certain sectors remained off-limits even to someone with her credentials. She'd never questioned this before. Every military installation had classified areas. That morning, as she walked toward the communications building, she noticed unusual activity near Hangar 7. The structure sat at the far end of the runway, typically used for aircraft maintenance. But, instead of the usual mechanics and pilots, she saw men in expensive civilian suits walking alongside high-ranking officers she didn't recognize. Their conversation seemed intense, punctuated by gestures toward the hangar's sealed doors. Sarah's curiosity sparked, but she pushed it aside. Military bases often hosted civilian contractors and visiting officials. Nothing unusual about that. She continued to her station, where her supervisor, Major Davidson, was already reviewing the morning's transmission logs. "Martinez, we've got some schedule changes today," Davidson said without looking up from his paperwork. "Command wants all communications from Sector 12 routed through a different channel. Here's the new protocol." He handed her a sealed envelope marked with classification stamps Sarah had never seen before. The routing instructions inside were unlike anything in their standard procedures. Instead of normal military channels, these transmissions would go through what appeared to be private networks with corporate encryption codes. "Sir, this routing seems unusual," Sarah said carefully. "Shouldn't Sector 12 communications follow standard military protocols?" Davidson's expression hardened. "Your job is to follow orders, Sergeant. Not to question them." The rebuke stung. Sarah had always maintained an excellent service record, and Davidson had never spoken to her so sharply. She nodded and began implementing the new routing procedures, but something felt wrong. In 3 years of service, she'd never seen communications deliberately diverted from standard military networks. Throughout the day, Sarah monitored the diverted transmissions. The messages were encrypted beyond her clearance level, but she could see their frequency and destination codes. The traffic was heavier than normal, with multiple transmissions every hour. More troubling, the destination codes didn't match any military installation she knew. During her lunch break, Sarah decided to take a walk near Hangar 7. She told herself it was innocent curiosity, nothing more. As she approached, she noticed the unusual security presence. Guard posts that normally had 1 soldier now had 3, and they weren't regular base security. These men wore different uniforms, black instead of the standard Air Force blue, with no visible unit insignia. "Excuse me, Sergeant," one of the black uniformed guards called out as she drew closer. "This area is temporarily restricted." "I didn't see any notices posted," Sarah replied. "I often walk this route during lunch. Orders came down this morning. Hangar 7 and surrounding areas are off-limits until further notice." Sarah nodded and changed direction, but not before noticing several unmarked trucks parked behind the hangar. The vehicles had no military markings, and their license plates were obscured. As she walked away, she heard the distinctive sound of heavy machinery operating inside the hangar, not the usual aircraft engines, but something different. Something that vibrated through the ground beneath her feet. That evening, Sarah returned to her quarters in the base housing complex. She shared a small apartment with her roommate, Lieutenant Jessica Chen, who worked in the base's financial division. Jessica was one of the few people Sarah trusted completely, and, over dinner, she cautiously brought up the day's oddities. "Jess, have you noticed anything unusual lately? Different procedures, new personnel, that sort of thing?" Jessica paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "Funny you should ask. I've been processing some strange requisitions this week. equipment purchases that don't match our normal suppliers, and the amounts are significant.
What kind of equipment?
That's the thing, the descriptions are vague.
Research materials, specialized components, that sort of language. But the costs suggest something major. We're talking millions of dollars, Sarah. Sarah felt a chill.
Military bases operated on strict budgets, and every purchase required detailed justification. Vague descriptions for million-dollar expenditures suggested someone was deliberately hiding the true nature of these purchases.
Have you tried checking with the requisition approvers?
I did. The approvals come from Colonel Brennan, but when I asked his office for clarification, they told me the information was above my clearance level. Colonel Brennan himself wasn't available for comment.
Sarah knew Colonel Brennan by reputation, a career officer with an impeccable record who'd commanded Whitmore Base for 5 years.
He wasn't known for mysterious behavior or secretive operations.
If he was involved in something requiring this level of secrecy, it had to be significant.
Over the next few days, Sarah paid closer attention to the base's rhythms and patterns. She noticed that certain personnel had begun working unusual hours. People she'd known for years were suddenly unavailable during normal duty hours but could be seen entering restricted areas late at night. The base's usual camaraderie seemed strained, with conversations stopping abruptly when she approached. The communications routing from Sector 12 continued, growing heavier each day. Sarah began keeping informal notes about the transmission times and frequencies, though she was careful not to violate any security protocols. She told herself she was just being thorough in her duties, but, deep down, she knew she was investigating something. On Friday of that week, Sarah volunteered for night duty. She rarely worked nights, preferring the day shift's regular hours, but she wanted to observe the base's nighttime activities. What she saw confirmed her growing suspicions that something significant was happening at Whitmore. Starting around 2200 hours, she noticed a pattern of movement she'd never seen before.
Personnel she didn't recognize moved between buildings using routes that avoided the main pathways and guard posts.
These weren't typical security patrols, they moved with purpose toward specific destinations, always in small groups, always staying in shadows. From her communications station, Sarah could see Hangar 7 in the distance. Throughout the night, she observed vehicles arriving and departing from the restricted area. The vehicles had no lights and made no sound on the base's radio frequencies, suggesting their movements weren't being logged through normal channels.
Around 0300 hours, Sarah made a decision that would change everything.
She left her station briefly, telling the duty officer she needed to check on a transmission antenna that had been showing irregular readings.
It wasn't entirely false, there had been some signal anomalies, though nothing requiring immediate attention.
The antenna she mentioned was located on a maintenance building that provided a clear view of Hangar 7 and the surrounding area. Sarah climbed to the roof access, ostensibly to check the antenna connections. What she saw made her blood run cold. The hangar doors were open, revealing an interior that bore no resemblance to a normal aircraft maintenance facility.
Instead of the expected tools and equipment, the hangar contained what appeared to be a sophisticated laboratory. She could see people in white coats working around tables covered with equipment she didn't recognize. Large screens displayed data and images, though she was too far away to make out details. Most disturbing were the containers being moved in and out of the hangar. They were unmarked metal cases, approximately the size of large suitcases, handled with extreme care by personnel wearing protective equipment. The cases were loaded into the unmarked vehicles she'd seen earlier, which then departed the base through a gate she hadn't known existed. Sarah realized she was witnessing something far beyond normal military operations. The secrecy, the civilian involvement, the diverted communications, and now this hidden laboratory suggested a program operating outside standard military protocols. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them reassuring. As she prepared to climb down from the roof, she heard footsteps on the ladder below. Panic shot through her as she realized someone else was coming up. She quickly moved to the antenna and began examining the connections, trying to look as though she was performing routine maintenance. "Sergeant Martinez?"
The voice belonged to Captain Reynolds, an officer she knew from the base administration.
"What are you doing here?" Checking the antenna, sir.
We've been getting some irregular signal readings, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't a hardware problem. Reynolds studied her for a long moment. In the moonlight, his expression was unreadable.
Find anything? Connections look good, sir. Might be atmospheric interference. I'll monitor it from the station.
Good. You should get back to your post.
It's not safe to be wandering around the base alone at night.
The warning felt more like a threat. Sarah nodded and climbed down, her heart pounding. As she walked back to the communications building, she felt Reynolds watching her until she was out of sight. Back at her station, Sarah tried to focus on her normal duties, but her mind kept returning to what she'd seen. The laboratory in Hangar 7, the mysterious containers, the warning from Captain Reynolds, it all pointed to a secret operation that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. She began to understand that her discovery of the communications rerouting hadn't been accidental. Someone had wanted those transmissions monitored by someone they trusted to follow orders without questions. But they'd underestimated her curiosity and her commitment to understanding what was happening at her base. As dawn approached and her shift ended, Sarah made another decision. She wouldn't report what she'd seen through normal channels. Something this secretive, this carefully hidden from standard military oversight, wouldn't be stopped by following proper procedures. The people running this operation clearly had authority at the highest levels of the base command.
Instead, she would continue observing and documenting.
She would gather evidence until she understood exactly what was happening at Whitmore Air Base. Only then could she decide how to expose what she increasingly believed was a betrayal of everything her uniform represented. Walking back to her quarters in the early morning light, Sarah Martinez had no idea that her investigation would soon put her life in danger and force her to choose between her military career and her conscience. The secret hidden in Hangar 7 was darker than anything she could imagine, and those protecting it would stop at nothing to keep it buried. The base looked peaceful in the dawnlight, its familiar buildings and runways suggesting the routine military life she'd known for years.
But Sarah now saw it differently.
Beneath the surface of normal operations, Whitmore Air Base harbored something that turned her stomach and made her question everything she'd believed about honor, duty, and serving her country. As she reached her quarters, Sarah noticed a black sedan parked across from the housing complex.
The same type of unmarked vehicle she'd seen at Hangar 7.
Someone was watching, and she suspected it wasn't for her protection.
The game had begun, though Sarah didn't yet realize she was playing it.
Her quest for answers had drawn attention from people who preferred to operate in shadows, people who viewed her curiosity as a threat to be eliminated. The uniform she wore with such pride had become a target, and soon, someone would demand she remove it forever. But Sarah Martinez was not the kind of person who backed down from a fight, especially when she believed right was on her side. She would continue her investigation, no matter the cost. The truth about Whitmore Air Base's darkest secret would come to light, even if it destroyed her career and put her life at risk. Little did she know, the people she was up against had already decided that her life was expendable.
The following Monday brought changes that confirmed Sarah's worst fears.
When she arrived at the communications center, she found her access codes had been modified. Systems she'd used daily for 3 years now displayed error messages when she tried to log in. Major Davidson was waiting with new assignments that effectively isolated her from any sensitive communications. "Martinez, you're being transferred to routine maintenance monitoring," Davidson announced without preamble.
"Equipment diagnostics, routine system checks, that sort of thing." "Sir, may I ask why?" "My performance reviews have always been excellent." "Command decisions don't require explanations, Sergeant." "Report to Technical Sergeant Williams in Building C." The transfer was clearly punishment for her nighttime activities, though they couldn't prove she'd seen anything suspicious. Sarah suspected Captain Reynolds had reported their rooftop encounter, leading to questions about her reliability. The military was nothing if not predictable when it came to handling potential security risks. Building C housed the base's older communication equipment, systems that were being phased out in favor of newer technology. Sarah's new supervisor, Technical Sergeant Williams, was a 20-year veteran who seemed genuinely puzzled by her transfer.
Don't know why they're moving someone with your skills to this assignment, Williams said as he showed her around the facility.
Most of this equipment barely gets used anymore. Seems like a waste of talent.
Sarah quickly realized her new position had an unexpected advantage. The older systems in Building C were connected to network infrastructure that spanned the entire base. While she couldn't access current operational communications, she could monitor system performance across all facilities, including areas that were supposedly off-limits. The network monitoring tools showed data flow patterns that revealed activity levels in different areas of the base. Sarah could see when systems in various buildings were being used heavily, when unusual data transfers occurred, and which facilities were consuming abnormal amounts of power. It was like having a bird's-eye view of the base's digital nervous system. What she discovered made her previous observations seem insignificant. Hangar 7 wasn't just consuming unusual amounts of power, it was drawing nearly as much electricity as the rest of the base combined. The data flows to and from the facility were enormous, suggesting either massive computational operations or continuous real-time communications with external networks.
More intriguingly, the power consumption followed a pattern. Every 72 hours, usage would spike dramatically for approximately 8 hours, then return to baseline levels.
Whatever was happening in Hangar 7 operated on a regular schedule, like a manufacturing process or experimental procedure. Sarah began correlating the power spikes with other observations.
The unmarked vehicle traffic she'd noticed also followed the same 72-hour cycle.
The diverted communications from Sector 12 increased dramatically during the high-power periods. Even the unusual personnel movements Jessica had mentioned seemed to align with this schedule. During her lunch breaks, Sarah continued her careful observations. The black uniformed security around Hangar 7 had become even tighter. They'd established a perimeter that extended well beyond the hangar itself, creating a secure zone that encompassed several smaller buildings she'd previously had access to. Warning signs had been posted, though they bore no military designations, just corporate-style security notices about authorized personnel only.
On Wednesday afternoon, Sarah's investigation took an unexpected turn.
While reviewing network performance logs, she discovered something that made her hands shake. The data transfers from Hangar 7 weren't just going to unknown external networks, some of them were being routed through servers she recognized as belonging to foreign corporations.
Military networks were supposed to be completely isolated from foreign entities.
The discovery meant that either someone was committing treason, or the operation in Hangar 7 had authorization at levels far above anything Sarah had imagined.
Neither possibility was reassuring. She spent the next several hours carefully documenting the network paths and transfer protocols.
The evidence was clear: data was flowing from Whitmore Air Base to servers in countries that were not always friendly to American interests. The volume of information being transmitted suggested either massive intelligence breaches or active collaboration with foreign entities. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would put her directly in the crosshairs of forces she didn't fully understand.
Instead of going directly home, she detoured past Hangar 7 during the evening shift change.
She wanted to see the faces of the people involved in whatever was happening there. What she saw changed everything. Among the civilians entering the restricted area, she recognized Dr. Marcus Chen, not Jessica's brother, but a man she knew from news reports. Dr. Chen was a prominent researcher who'd been in the headlines 2 years earlier for allegedly selling military research to foreign governments. The charges had been dropped due to insufficient evidence, but his reputation in defense circles was permanently tarnished. Seeing Dr. Chen at Whitmore Base confirmed Sarah's worst suspicions. This wasn't a classified military research project, it was something far more sinister. The presence of a suspected foreign agent on a secure military installation suggested corruption at the highest levels of command. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. If Dr. Chen was involved, the operation in Hangar 7 likely involved selling military secrets or technology to foreign powers. The regular schedule, the massive data transfers, the foreign server connections, it all pointed to systematic espionage operating under the protection of military security. As she watched from a distance, Sarah noticed something else that made her stomach churn. Colonel Brennan himself emerged from Hangar 7, shaking hands with Dr. Chen and several other civilians.
The base commander wasn't just aware of the operation, he was actively participating in it. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Colonel Brennan had been her commanding officer's commanding officer, a man she'd respected and trusted. Seeing him collaborating with suspected foreign agents felt like a personal betrayal of everything she'd sworn to defend. Sarah knew she was now in serious danger. Discovering a spy ring operating with the base commander's knowledge and participation meant she possessed information that people would kill to protect. The black sedan she'd noticed near her quarters suddenly took on a more ominous meaning. Over the next 2 days, Sarah was careful to maintain normal routines while secretly preparing for what she increasingly believed would be a confrontation. She began making copies of the evidence she'd gathered, storing them in multiple locations off the base. She also started varying her routes and schedules, making it harder for anyone to predict her movements. On Friday, her caution proved justified. Major Davidson summoned her to his office with news that confirmed her fears. "Martinez, you're being reassigned effective immediately. Orders came down from command for you to report to Fort Hamilton in New York." Fort Hamilton was primarily an administrative facility, the kind of assignment given to personnel being pushed toward discharge. Sarah knew the transfer was designed to remove her from Whitmore before she could cause problems. "Sir, I'd like to request a delay to finish some equipment diagnostics I'm working on." "Negative. Your replacement arrives Monday. You have the weekend to pack and process out." Sarah nodded calmly, but internally she was calculating her options. The hasty transfer meant someone had identified her as a threat. They wanted her gone before the next 72-hour cycle, which would begin Sunday night. That evening, Sarah met with Jessica to share what she'd discovered, carefully choosing her words to protect her roommate while ensuring someone else knew the truth. "Jess, I need you to know that I've stumbled onto something serious here at the base. I can't give you details, but if anything happens to me, there are people you need to contact." Jessica's face went pale. "Sarah, what are you talking about? What kind of trouble are you in?" "I've discovered that some of the unusual activities we've noticed aren't legitimate military operations. There are people here who are betraying their oaths, and I have evidence." Sarah gave Jessica a sealed envelope containing contact information for military investigators she'd researched, along with instructions for accessing the evidence she'd hidden off-base. She made Jessica promise to use the information if Sarah disappeared or had an accident. That night, Sarah barely slept. Every sound outside her quarters made her jump, every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. She'd moved beyond casual observation into active resistance, and there was no turning back. Saturday brought the confrontation she'd been dreading. As she returned from the commissary, Captain Reynolds was waiting outside her quarters, accompanied by 2 of the black uniformed security personnel she'd seen around Hangar 7. "Sergeant Martinez, you need to come with us. Colonel Brennan wants to see you." Sarah's training took over. She remained calm and compliant while her mind raced through possibilities. "Of course, sir. May I ask what this is regarding?" "The colonel will explain." They escorted her to the base headquarters building, but instead of taking her to Colonel Brennan's office, they led her to a conference room in the basement. The room had no windows and only one door, which Reynolds closed behind them. Colonel Brennan was waiting, along with Dr. Chen and 2 men Sarah didn't recognize. The civilians wore expensive suits and had the bearing of people accustomed to authority. One of them stepped forward as Sarah was directed to a chair facing the group. "Sergeant Martinez, my name is Director Walsh. I'm with a government agency that handles sensitive national security matters. We understand you've been asking questions about classified operations." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "Sir, I've simply been performing my assigned duties." "Your duties don't include conducting unauthorized surveillance of restricted facilities." "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." Director Walsh nodded to one of his companions, who opened a laptop and turned it toward Sarah. The screen showed satellite footage of her rooftop visit to check the antenna, clearly capturing her observing Hangar 7. "We have extensive documentation of your activities, Sergeant. The question now is what we do about it." Colonel Brennan leaned forward. Martinez, you're a good soldier who's gotten in over her head. The operation you've been watching is classified at levels that require congressional approval. It's completely legal and authorized. Then, why all the secrecy, sir? Why the foreign server connections and the civilian contractors with questionable backgrounds? The question clearly surprised them.
Dr. Chen exchanged glances with Director Walsh, while Colonel Brennan's jaw tightened.
You've accessed classified information systems, Walsh said. That's a federal crime. I've monitored publicly available network performance data as part of my assigned duties. Nothing I've accessed required special clearance.
Sarah could see they hadn't expected her to be so well informed about the technical aspects of her discoveries.
The room fell silent as they contemplated their options.
Finally, Director Walsh spoke.
Sergeant Martinez, you have two choices.
You can accept a medical discharge with full benefits and a comfortable pension, forgetting everything you think you've seen here. Or you can face court-martial for unauthorized access to classified information and espionage. The threat was clear, but Sarah had prepared for this moment. I'd like to exercise my right to legal representation before making any decisions about my future.
I'm afraid that's not possible. This matter falls under national security provisions that supersede normal military justice procedures.
Sarah realized she was being offered a choice between silence and destruction, with no middle ground for exposing the truth. The people in this room had the power to destroy her career, her reputation, and possibly her life. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed she was acting alone. Sarah looked directly at Director Walsh and made a decision that would either save her life or end it. Sir, I need you to know that my roommate Lieutenant Chen has been instructed to contact military investigators if I don't return to my quarters by 1800 hours today. She has detailed information about my discoveries and the locations where I've stored additional evidence.
The room went completely silent.
Dr. Chen shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Colonel Brennan's face flushed red. Director Walsh's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. They'd been planning to make her disappear quietly, but she just complicated their plans significantly. You're bluffing, Walsh said after a long pause.
Lieutenant Chen processed the unusual requisitions that first drew my attention.
She's already suspicious about the financial irregularities. If I disappear, she'll have all the motivation she needs to take our evidence to the appropriate authorities. Colonel Brennan slammed his hand on the table. Martinez, you have no idea what you're interfering with.
This operation is saving American lives. By selling military secrets to foreign governments, sir?
By preventing a war that would kill millions of people, Dr. Chen interjected.
The technology we're sharing isn't weapons, it's medical research that could revolutionize treatment for diseases that affect people worldwide. Sarah felt a moment of confusion.
Medical research didn't align with her observations of the heavy security, massive data transfers, and suspicious behavior. Either Dr. Chen was lying, or there was something she didn't understand about what she'd witnessed.
If it's legitimate medical research, why the secrecy? Why the foreign servers and the off-the-books funding?
Director Walsh leaned back in his chair.
Because some aspects of scientific progress require flexibility that normal government procedures don't allow. Bureaucracy kills innovation, Sergeant. Sometimes saving lives requires working outside traditional channels.
And making millions of dollars in the process, Sarah added, thinking of the financial irregularities Jessica had discovered.
The researchers deserve compensation for their work, Colonel Brennan said defensively. This isn't about money, it's about advancing human knowledge. Sarah wasn't convinced.
Even if the research had legitimate medical applications, the methods being used violated military regulations and, potentially, federal law.
The presence of foreign servers and unauthorized personnel on a military installation couldn't be justified by medical necessity.
Sir, I understand the importance of medical research, but what I've observed suggests this operation extends beyond what you're describing. The communication patterns, the security measures, the timing of activities, it all points to something more than research collaboration. Director Walsh and Dr. Chen exchanged another look that confirmed Sarah's suspicions. They were hiding something significant, and their explanations didn't match the evidence she'd gathered. Sergeant Martinez, Walsh said carefully, "You're correct that our operation has multiple components. The medical research is just one aspect. We're also working to prevent the proliferation of dangerous technologies by sharing controlled information with allied nations." Which allied nations require secret communication channels and off-the-books funding? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah could see that her persistence was frustrating them, but she also sensed they were genuinely concerned about the evidence she'd gathered. Their concerns suggested her discoveries were more damaging than she'd realized. Colonel Brennan stood up abruptly. "This conversation is over. Martinez, you have until Monday morning to decide whether you accept the medical discharge or face the consequences of your interference." "Sir, I need more information before I can make that decision. If this operation is legitimate, there should be documentation I can review." "The documentation is classified beyond your clearance level." "Then, arrange for me to receive the necessary clearance, sir. If I'm going to keep quiet about what I've seen, I need to understand what I'm protecting." Sarah's request clearly caught them off guard. By asking for higher clearance rather than simply accepting their explanations, she was forcing them to either provide proof of the operation's legitimacy or admit they couldn't justify it through normal channels. Director Walsh whispered something to Colonel Brennan, who nodded reluctantly. "Very well, Sergeant. We'll arrange for you to observe one of our research sessions. But this comes with conditions. You'll sign additional security agreements, and you'll be accompanied by security personnel at all times." "Understood, sir." "When would this observation take place?" "Tomorrow night. The next research cycle begins at 2,100 hours. Sarah realized they were giving her access to see what happened during the high-power consumption periods she'd identified. Whether they planned to show her the truth or an elaborate deception remained to be seen. "I'll need to inform Lieutenant Chen that my schedule has changed so she doesn't take any unnecessary action." "You'll tell her nothing specific," Walsh warned. "Any deviation from our agreement will result in immediate consequences for both of you." The threat was clear, but Sarah had bought herself time and an opportunity to gather more concrete evidence. If the operation was truly legitimate, she would see proof. If it wasn't, she might be able to gather enough information to expose it properly. After being escorted back to her quarters, Sarah found Jessica waiting anxiously. "What happened?" "Those men looked serious. I can't give you details yet, but I may have more information soon. Just be ready to use what I gave you if something goes wrong." That evening, Sarah prepared carefully for whatever she might encounter the next night. She researched everything she could about Dr. Chen's background, Director Walsh's possible agency affiliations, and the types of medical research that might require the security measures she'd observed. What she discovered was troubling. Dr. Chen's previous research had involved biological agents that could be used for either medical treatment or biological warfare. The ambiguity made it impossible to determine whether his current work was beneficial or dangerous without seeing the actual research. Director Walsh proved more difficult to trace, but Sarah found references to a private consulting firm that worked with government agencies on sensitive projects. The firm had contracts with multiple federal departments, including some with questionable reputations for following legal procedures. Sunday passed slowly as Sarah waited for the promised revelation. She spent the day reviewing her evidence one more time, ensuring she hadn't missed any crucial details. The pattern of activities at the base had become clear, but the true purpose of the operation remained mysterious. As evening approached, Sarah reported to the headquarters building as instructed. Captain Reynolds was waiting with 2 security escorts, neither of whom she recognized from normal base personnel. Their equipment and bearing suggested they were private contractors rather than military security. "Sergeant Martinez, tonight you'll observe a research session in progress. You're not to speak unless directly addressed, and you're not to touch any equipment or materials." "Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." They drove to Hangar 7 in an unmarked vehicle, approaching through a gate Sarah had never seen used before. The route bypassed the normal base checkpoints, reinforcing her suspicion that this operation was designed to avoid standard military oversight.
The hangar's interior was even more impressive than she'd glimpsed from the rooftop.
The space had been converted into a sophisticated laboratory with equipment that looked more advanced than anything she'd seen on military installations. Multiple workstations were staffed by researchers in protective gear, working with materials she couldn't identify from a distance.
Dr. Chen approached as they entered. "Sergeant Martinez, welcome to Project Prometheus.
What you're seeing here represents the cutting edge of medical research into infectious disease prevention." Sarah observed the activity around her carefully. The researchers were indeed working with what appeared to be biological materials, but the scale and security measures suggested something more significant than typical medical research.
Large containment units lined one wall, each marked with symbols she recognized as biological hazard warnings. Dr. Chen, what specifically are you researching?
We're developing targeted treatments for diseases that could be weaponized by hostile nations.
By understanding how these diseases work, we can create both vaccines and antidotes.
The explanation sounded plausible, but Sarah noticed something troubling. Some of the researchers were working with materials that appeared to be samples rather than treatments. They seemed to be analyzing existing biological agents rather than developing cures. Director Walsh appeared beside her.
The research has dual applications, Sergeant.
Understanding diseases allows us to both defend against them and, if necessary, deploy them in controlled ways.
The admission sent chills down Sarah's spine.
Walsh had just confirmed that Project Prometheus involved developing biological weapons, not just defenses against them.
The medical research story had been a cover for something far more dangerous. "Sir, developing biological weapons violates international treaties. Developing defensive capabilities doesn't.
Everything we're doing here falls within legal parameters." Sarah doubted that claim, especially given the foreign server connections and unauthorized funding she discovered. The research might begin as defensive, but the same work could easily be adapted for offensive purposes. As they continued through the facility, Sarah saw evidence that confirmed her worst fears. One section of the laboratory contained equipment for large-scale production of biological materials. Another area had what appeared to be testing chambers where the effects of different agents could be observed. Most disturbing was a secure storage area where dozens of sealed containers were kept in specialized refrigeration units. The containers were labeled with codes rather than names, but their number and careful storage suggested a substantial inventory of dangerous materials.
Dr. Chen noticed her interest in the storage area.
Those contain samples from around the world.
Diseases that have been eradicated or contained in their natural environments.
We study them to understand how they might be artificially enhanced or weaponized.
And then, what happens to that information?
It's shared with allied nations so they can develop their own defenses. Sarah realized she was witnessing the systematic collection and study of the world's most dangerous diseases, with the knowledge being distributed to foreign governments through unofficial channels.
Whether the stated defensive purpose was genuine or not, the potential for misuse was enormous. The tour continued for another hour, during which Sarah saw enough evidence to confirm that Project Prometheus was far more than a medical research program.
The facility was equipped to develop, test, and produce biological agents on a scale that could only be intended for warfare applications. When they finally escorted her back to the entrance, Director Walsh made one final attempt to secure her silence. "Sergeant Martinez, you've now seen the full scope of our operation.
I hope you understand why absolute secrecy is necessary."
"I understand the implications of what you're doing, sir."
"Good.
Then, you'll accept the medical discharge and leave quietly."
Sarah looked at him directly. "Sir, I need time to process what I've seen. This is more complex than I expected. You have until tomorrow morning to decide.
After that, your options become much more limited." The threat was clear, but Sarah had gathered the evidence she needed.
Project Prometheus was indeed the dangerous operation she'd suspected, involving the development of biological weapons under the cover of defensive research. The foreign connections she'd discovered weren't just sharing medical knowledge, they were distributing biological warfare capabilities to countries that might use them against American interests. As she returned to her quarters, Sarah knew she faced the most important decision of her life. She could accept their offer and walk away, allowing a potentially catastrophic program to continue. Or she could risk everything to expose the truth. The evidence she'd gathered, combined with what Jessica had observed about the financial irregularities, would be enough to trigger a major investigation if it reached the right people. But getting it to those people would require surviving long enough to deliver it. Sarah Martinez had always believed in serving her country with honor. Now she faced the ultimate test of that commitment. Taking down Project Prometheus would mean betraying her commanding officers and risking charges of treason. But allowing it to continue would mean betraying everything her uniform was supposed to represent. As she prepared for what might be her final night at Whitmore Air Base, Sarah made her choice. Some secrets were too dangerous to keep, regardless of the personal cost. Sarah spent the night preparing for what she knew would be the most dangerous mission of her life. She couldn't simply walk off the base with evidence of Project Prometheus. The security measures around the program would detect any attempts to remove classified materials. Instead, she needed to get the information to outside authorities while maintaining the appearance of cooperation with Walsh's demands. At 0500 hours, 2 hours before she was supposed to report for her final meeting with Colonel Brennan, Sarah quietly left her quarters. She'd told Jessica she was going for an early morning run, a routine that wouldn't seem suspicious to anyone monitoring her activities. But, instead of heading to the track, she made her way to Building C, where her network monitoring equipment provided the key to her escape plan. The older communication systems had capabilities that the new equipment lacked, including direct connections to civilian internet infrastructure that bypassed military security protocols. Sarah had discovered these connections during her technical work, noting them as potential security vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. Now those same vulnerabilities would serve a different purpose. Working quickly, Sarah accessed the civilian networks and sent encrypted messages to the contacts she'd researched: military investigators, congressional oversight committees, and journalists who specialized in national security issues. She couldn't include the full evidence in the messages due to security constraints, but she provided enough information to trigger investigations and told them where to find the complete documentation she'd hidden off-base. The critical message went to General Patricia Morrison, Inspector General of the Air Force, whose office had authority to investigate operations that violated military regulations. Sarah's message was carefully worded to request an immediate inspection of Whitmore Air Base based on evidence of unauthorized research activities and foreign intelligence connections. As she worked, Sarah heard vehicles approaching Building C. Through the window, she could see the black uniformed security personnel who'd become a constant presence around restricted areas. They were moving with the purposeful urgency of people who knew exactly where they were going. Sarah finished her transmissions and quickly deleted the access logs, making it appear as though the civilian networks had been accessed for routine maintenance purposes. She then activated a diagnostic program that would generate normal-looking system activity for the next several hours, providing cover for her unauthorized use of the equipment. The security team entered the building as Sarah was completing her cover-up. She continued working at the diagnostic console, appearing to be performing routine maintenance as they approached. "Sergeant Martinez, you're needed at headquarters immediately. I'm just finishing up some system checks. Can I have 10 more minutes?" "Negative. Orders are to bring you in now." Sarah saved her work and logged off the systems, knowing she'd done everything possible to ensure the truth about Project Prometheus would reach the proper authorities. Whether she survived to see the investigation's results was now beyond her control. At headquarters, she found the same group waiting in the conference room, but their demeanor had changed dramatically. Director Walsh looked angry rather than concerned, while Colonel Brennan appeared nervous and distracted. Dr. Chen was absent, replaced by two men who had the bearing of professional soldiers despite their civilian clothes. "Sergeant Martinez," Walsh began without preamble, "we've detected unauthorized network activity from your workstation this morning. Care to explain?" Sarah maintained her composure despite her racing heart. "Sir, I've been running diagnostic programs to prepare the systems for my replacement. The activity logs should reflect routine maintenance procedures. The activity logs show connections to external networks.
Some of the diagnostic routines test external connectivity to verify that security protocols are working properly.
It's standard procedure when transitioning equipment to new personnel. Walsh studied her for a long moment, clearly uncertain whether to believe her explanation.
The technical nature of her work provided plausible cover for activities that would otherwise be obviously suspicious. Colonel Brennan leaned forward. "Martinez, we're prepared to honor our agreement.
Accept the medical discharge, and this entire matter disappears. You'll receive full benefits and a clean record."
"Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I need to understand the legal implications of what I've witnessed. If Project Prometheus is operating under proper authority, there should be documentation I can review to satisfy my concerns." The request seemed to frustrate them, but Sarah was buying time for her messages to reach their intended recipients.
The longer she could delay their final ultimatum, the better chance her evidence had of triggering an investigation.
"The documentation exists, but it's classified at levels that require special approval," one of the new men said.
"Approval that takes time to obtain." "How much time?"
"Several days, possibly longer." Sarah realized they were stalling as much as she was, but for different reasons. They needed to determine how much she knew and whether her network activity had compromised the program. Her continued insistence on seeing documentation was making them nervous about simply eliminating her. "Sir, I understand the need for security, but I've already seen the program in operation. Additional documentation would help me understand the legal framework that authorizes what I've observed." Walsh nodded to one of his companions, who left the room. The remaining group sat in uncomfortable silence, clearly waiting for something or someone. Sarah suspected they were consulting with higher authorities about how to handle her persistent demands for transparency. After 20 minutes, the man who'd left returned and whispered something to Walsh, whose expression grew even grimmer.
"Sergeant Martinez, circumstances have changed. We're no longer in a position to offer you the medical discharge option."
Sarah's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm.
"What's changed, sir?"
"Your network activity this morning has triggered security concerns that require immediate resolution. You're being transferred to a secure facility for debriefing."
The euphemism didn't disguise the reality. They were planning to disappear her.
The messages she'd sent had either been detected or had reached their targets and prompted responses that threatened the program's security. "Sir, I'd like to contact my roommate to let her know about the transfer."
"That won't be possible. This facility doesn't allow external communications."
Sarah realized she was running out of time and options. They were moving to eliminate her as a threat, but their nervous behavior suggested her investigation had already caused damage to their operation. The question now was whether she could survive long enough for that damage to become fatal to Project Prometheus.
"Colonel Brennan, sir, as my commanding officer, don't you have an obligation to ensure I receive proper legal representation?"
Brennan shifted uncomfortably.
"This matter falls under national security provisions that supersede normal military justice procedures." "What national security provisions authorize the detention of military personnel without legal representation?"
The question clearly made him uncomfortable. Sarah could see that Brennan, despite his involvement in Project Prometheus, retained some respect for military law and procedures. Her challenge to the legal basis for their actions was forcing him to confront the illegal nature of what they were doing.
Walsh intervened before Brennan could respond.
"Sergeant Martinez, your cooperation would be appreciated, but it's not required. You're coming with us regardless." As the security personnel moved to escort her from the room, alarms began sounding throughout the building. Emergency lights flashed as the base's public address system activated with an announcement that made Walsh's face go white.
"All personnel, this is base security. We have incoming federal investigators with search warrants for specific facilities. All personnel are to remain at their current locations until further notice. Base commanders report to headquarters immediately." Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with terror.
Her messages had reached their targets faster than expected, but the response was also forcing a confrontation that could turn violent. The people running Project Prometheus had too much to lose to surrender quietly. Walsh grabbed a radio and began issuing rapid orders in a coded language Sarah didn't recognize. The security personnel escorted her toward a door she hadn't seen before, hidden behind what appeared to be a filing cabinet. The escape route suggested they'd planned for the possibility of having to evacuate the headquarters building quickly. As they moved through a narrow corridor that led to an underground passage, Sarah heard gunfire from somewhere above. The federal investigators had encountered resistance, confirming that Project Prometheus involved people willing to kill to protect their secrets. The passage led to a parking garage beneath the building, where several vehicles waited with engines running. Walsh pushed her toward one of the cars while speaking urgently into his radio.
Phoenix is compromised. Execute Contingency Plan Alpha.
All priority materials to the backup facility immediately. Sarah realized that Project Prometheus had backup locations and procedures for exactly this situation.
Even if the investigation shut down the Whitmore operation, the program could continue elsewhere.
Her evidence might have triggered an investigation, but it wouldn't necessarily stop what she'd discovered. As they drove away from headquarters, Sarah could see federal agents moving toward Hangar 7 while base security personnel maintained a careful distance. The investigators had arrived in force, with vehicles and equipment that suggested they were prepared for serious resistance. The car carrying Sarah headed toward the base's perimeter, following routes that avoided the main checkpoints where investigators might intercept them. Walsh continued coordinating what appeared to be a complex evacuation operation designed to preserve the most critical aspects of the program.
"Where are you taking me?" Sarah asked.
"Somewhere quiet where we can discuss your future without interruptions." The implication was clear: they planned to kill her once they were safely away from the base and the federal investigation.
But Sarah hadn't survived this long by giving up easily.
As they approached the base's outer perimeter, Sarah noticed that their route would take them past the antenna maintenance building where she'd first observed Hangar 7. The building's roof access ladder was clearly visible, triggering an idea that might save her life. When the car slowed to navigate a turn near the building, Sarah acted. She grabbed the steering wheel and yanked it hard to the right, sending the vehicle off the road and into the building's support structure. The impact wasn't severe enough to cause serious injuries, but it created enough confusion for Sarah to escape through the damaged passenger door. She ran toward the antenna building as shots fired behind her. Walsh and his security personnel were pursuing, but the crash had given her a crucial head start. Sarah climbed the maintenance ladder as bullets struck the building around her, reaching the roof just as federal helicopters appeared overhead. From the rooftop, Sarah could see the full scope of the federal response. Investigators had surrounded Hangar 7 and were systematically searching the facility. Multiple arrests were being made, though many of the key figures appeared to have escaped through routes similar to the one Walsh had used. More importantly, she could see that the investigators had seized trucks full of the mysterious containers she'd observed being moved from Hangar 7. Whatever biological materials Project Prometheus had been developing were now in federal custody. Walsh and his team reached the base of the building, but the federal helicopters were circling overhead and additional ground units were approaching. Faced with capture by federal agents, Walsh made a final radio transmission before ordering his team to withdraw.
"Phoenix is blown.
All primary assets compromised.
Initiate termination protocols."
Sarah realized that Walsh was ordering the destruction of evidence and possibly elimination of witnesses who could connect higher authorities to Project Prometheus. The investigation had successfully shut down the Whitmore operation, but the people behind it were preparing to cover their tracks. As federal agents secured the area around the antenna building and helped Sarah down from the roof, she provided them with the locations of all the evidence she'd hidden off base. The information would help investigators understand the full scope of what they'd discovered, but Sarah suspected many questions would remain unanswered. In the days that followed, the investigation revealed that Project Prometheus had been operating for over 2 years with funding from private sources connected to foreign governments. The biological research had indeed involved the development of both defensive and offensive capabilities, with the offensive applications being shared with nations that were not traditional American allies.
Colonel Brennan was arrested and, eventually convicted of treason, though he maintained until his trial that he believed the program was authorized by classified national security directives. Dr. Chin disappeared before he could be apprehended, presumably fleeing to one of the countries that had been receiving Project Prometheus research data. Director Walsh was never identified by his real name, and the consulting firm he claimed to represent proved to be a front organization with no legitimate business operations. The investigation concluded that Walsh was likely an agent of a foreign intelligence service, though his exact identity and nationality remained classified. Sarah Martinez was cleared of any wrongdoing and received commendation for her role in exposing the operation. However, the experience had fundamentally changed her perspective on military service. She accepted early retirement and became an advocate for stronger oversight of classified research programs. The true scope of Project Prometheus was never fully revealed to the public. Official reports described it as a limited biological research program that exceeded its authorization, without mentioning the foreign intelligence connections or the scale of the biological weapons development that Sarah had witnessed. But Sarah knew the truth about what she'd uncovered at Whitmore Air Base. The darkest secret hadn't been the illegal research or even the foreign collaboration, it had been the willingness of people in positions of trust to betray their oaths for money and ideology. The uniform she'd worn with such pride represented ideals that were worth any sacrifice to protect. Taking off that uniform had been painful, but staying silent about what she'd discovered would have been a betrayal of everything it stood for. Years later, when asked about her decision to risk everything to expose Project Prometheus, Sarah's answer was simple: some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and some oaths are too important to break. When you discover that people in authority are betraying the values you've sworn to defend, staying quiet becomes the real treason. The moment she'd been ordered to take off that uniform had been the moment she'd chosen to prove she deserved to wear it.